Hello, everyone. Welcome to Risk Roundup. Information and communication technologies are as essential to modern society as air, food, and water. Life today would be utterly unthinkable without information and communication technologies. While information and communication technologies has connected the society and removed the barriers of communication for individuals across nations' geographical boundaries, it has also helped private entities across nations to allow collaboration, reduce cost, improve processes, boost innovation, and increase productivity while at the same time making the public sector leaner, faster, and more citizen friendly. But the most important contribution of the information and communication technology is perhaps the ability to access the real time and authentic information without the filters of propaganda model, which individuals are able to use across nations to tackle the critical challenges of not only our time but also of the coming future. To discuss this further, I'm delighted to welcome Becky Bace. Becky is Chief Strategist, Center for Forensics, Information Technology and Security in United States. Welcome, Becky. We are delighted to have you on Risk Roundup.
Oh, thank you very much.
So, Becky, let's start with this. There are many who feel that there is a strong systematic tendency to underestimate the influence of information and communication technology as not only a powerful economic force, but also a tool for fundamental cultural and societal
Also,
change.
another
What are
deal is
your
that I'm not
thoughts
for the
about the
U.S.
impact of
I
information and
don't do this for the
communication
U.S. I
technology
do this
and its
for
power and
the
potential to change
University of
the
South
world?
Alabama. And I apologize for any ambiguities there.
Okay, no
So
problem.
it's also abbreviated USA, which it drives me crazy. But
So this center is part of University of Alabama.
yes, no, it's a separate university. It's a regional university
I
for
see.
this area of Alabama.
Okay, I'm glad you clarified.
So sorry on that. I have done the high government thing. It's just been a while,
No, that's quite all right.
and for whatever it's worth, I still advise the folks at national level. So,
Okay. Okay.
but I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was ambiguity there. Okay, so back into it. It's absolutely critical. It's impossible, I think, to conceive of a modern world absent information technology. And I can remember it becomes a sign of how long one has been in the area. But I can remember in the earliest days of working in computer security specifically, in which the primary worry was that no one would ever pay attention to us. That we would see problems in computing and it would always be very much a niche thing, only the things that geeks or the military worried about because nobody else messed with that stuff. And of course, now we can't imagine, people I think can't imagine getting out of bed in the morning without having to deal with some aspect of IT.
That is true. That is true. So, when it comes to the role of information and communication technology as an economic force, the direct and indirect contribution to economic growth made by digital information and communication technologies is largely due to the fact that each of the component, irrespective of software, hardware, information and communication technologies and services, are interconnected, interrelated, interdependent, and interdisciplinary areas. A great many products and services in cyberspace across industries and nations depend directly and indirect or indirectly on the digital information and communication technologies. So, which particular digital information and communication technologies has enabled nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia to be the transformative force of change?
I think that it is inherent there. Part of the first effects I believe we saw is that it effectively warped time and space, such that on the one hand, it didn't matter whether the right person speaking in a meeting was he was 2 continents away. perhaps speaking with the assistance of someone else, who was translating for them. Clue was clue. The second piece of it is that these things are effectively give us an alternate universe in which we do very, very critical things. One of the attributes of that universe is that the time clock runs at a totally different speed. We do trades, for instance, in the financial world at oh heavens, millions of times the speed of those that we did even 30 years ago. We do issues and frankly get blowback for them. We basically utter things within the audible range of a network connection and have it in the press, anymore in a matter of minutes. And so find ourselves, I think, kind of people in the political realm find themselves policing and shaping messages in very, very different ways, simply because of that particular warp in time and in space. They are in a position where they can say something that in the past would have gone for weeks without notice, that now is blasted to millions of people, depending on the nature of the storm, and for which they may be getting irate phone calls and threats of war 15 minutes later. So it's changed things, I think, across the board in really, really profound ways. There's good news and there's bad news. If you're doing wonderful things, if you're doing things that have a truly transformative effect, your chances of getting out there are in some ways better. If you're doing things that perhaps are not as laudable or that are considered far more polarizing, you don't get a lot of room to maneuver around missteps. It's not a particularly forgiving environment. So it changes the very nature of the game. And one area I think that I and a lot of folks who are in cybersecurity find fascinating in an ongoing way is that we understand that the issues that we deal with are issues that profoundly affect the trust that people are willing to invest in what happens or their perception of what happens. And this ranges from the individual to the nation state. You're in a position where you hear things that appear to have happened, but if it becomes a marker of how sophisticated you are in terms of to what degree you trust what you've just heard or just seen or just had reported to you. Yes. So it's a very, very profound effect.
That's very true, and you are right. There is information, and then there is misinformation. So there is always that challenge. Yeah, we have the access to all the real-time news and real-time events that are happening in the world, but at the same time, we don't know exactly which are the authentic, which are the genuine news, and what is just misinformation that is being spreaded. So it brings both good and bad, like you said. So let's talk about some of these challenges. That there is a growing fear that technology brings nations critical risks of cyber attacks, massive incidents of data fraud or theft, along with massive digital information and misinformation. So while technology has the potential to bring both good and bad, is it fair to blame technology as a cause of critical global issues?
It effectively has a first order effect of simply enabling folks to communicate in ways that they could not or might not be inclined to otherwise. So effectively, it makes non-optional what used to be a discretionary thing in terms of the level to which you're connected with what is happening, big quotes. You've always had folks who would be information junkies, as it were, who would be tuned into 5 different television stations, all news channels, and read, 4 major newspapers every day, cover to cover, as part of their shtick. Now it's not so optional. because of the availability of those channels, as well as those who would sell you the ability to buy filtered versions of what's happening on those channels, for a price, to shape their message so that they can affect your behavior. It becomes a different scene. You don't really have the option to tune out there.
Yes.
Also, you're in a position where there's a second and third order effect of this. As I alluded to before, it changes the nature, the clock speed differential, the amount of time that goes between something happening geographically far from you and your ability to ignore it has simply gone away. The accessibility, it ends up being less and less an option. So things that you might have been able to roll your eyes and say, I don't deal with that geographically, or simply, particularly if you're in the corporate world or in the government world, you don't have the option. You don't have it's not your discretionary move at that point to determine that you can and cannot pay attention to things based on a divide, a geographical divide. And there's not necessarily any indication that you don't necessarily have the ability also to ignore and differentiate based on what you see on the wire, what's important and what's not.
That we just don't have the bandwidth now to tune off, about the events happening across nations' geographical boundaries. So the digital global age has changed everything. So it's not just what events are happening in our country within our national boundaries, but also what is happening across within other nations. That also has a big impact because of the disappearing or the blurring boundaries of nations right now in digital global age. So yeah, go ahead, please continue.
But there, I think too, though, that the third order effect I alluded to, though, is that all the things that had been considered traditional wisdom, this comprises a lot of things that you're exposed to, for instance, in undergrad and graduate education, in areas where there is a strategic component. The rules have changed, and they've changed quite profoundly. A lot of things that are considered mother's milk this is how you support sound decisions. These are things that traditionally stand up to scrutiny as having been derived of sound process. Now are changed as well. And I don't think that the wisdom has necessarily been updated to reflect the effect that being on the IT pipe, as an information source has really scaled to meet those needs. If I have any particularly overarching concern, that would be it. I deal a lot, and this is simply a matter of as much personal connection interest, but I've dealt with the legal in law enforcement realm since pretty much the beginning of my cybersecurity career, and have been really, really fascinated with how evidence that has its origins in IT make it to court, and how they get integrated in basically a legacy-driven system. And it turns out in fits and starts, it's not a very graceful integration. And I think that perhaps that's in the best of situations. I think that in less well-ordered places where you have less formalism wrapped around government, that it's an even more awkward integration. So you have situations where you have certain sort of pillars of society, of civilization, that rely on certain legacy means of dealing with the information that's presented to you. And an information source now that in terms of currency, in terms of the arrival time of the factoids, as well as trustability. You don't have any of the standard classic trappings, intuitive trappings, that allow you to determine whether you trust something or not, trust an information source or not. All of the traditional wisdom kind of ends up on much shakier ground than it might have been even a decade ago. So that becomes a really, really critical way of which this deals with things. And it's something that I think is ample fodder for folks who are trying to keep up with this, be it on an academic level, on an operational level. The joke we have is that being a security officer is at once wonderful if you don't deal well with boredom. It also is the most stressful job on earth, simply because you have no real rule book. You only have folks who can instruct you in one or another aspect of it, and that it's just a frustrating scene.
Yes, it is. It is. I hear you because the cyberspace has brought us so many challenges because right now there are no rules of war that is happening in the cyberspace. There are all kinds of war going on in cyberspace, and because of cyberspace, and without any proper structured guidelines or rules of engagement. So security industry has a huge challenge right now because they just don't know what they're dealing with and how they should be addressing that, and what boundaries they have, or what criteria they have, or how much they are able to address. So it is a very complex time for the security industry, especially when the whole nature and definition and meaning of security has changed, because security historically was just about managing their territories and by physical force and things like that. Now security, the meaning of security has completely changed. So it is a challenging time for security industry, and the the what is interesting is that people need to integrate, define and integrate the meaning of security that is fit, or that is worthy enough for the cyberspace, geospace and space, and that can unite the boundaries of security in all three, cyberspace, geospace and space, because of the integrated nature of the nations, its government, industries, organizations and academia. So it's a very interesting and challenging time. So let's go forward with this discussion. While natural disasters and the general threats of digital information technology systems and data that includes hardware and software failures, malware, viruses, spam, scams, and phishing, and human error are a cause of concern. It is the criminal threats of information technology systems and data which comes in the security breaches that is not only a cause of concern but shaking up the global power structure. What are the threats that you see are the most critical for not only the industries but for the survival of nations?
Oh, heavens. I can't even begin to deal. I think that if I were to look at it, if I come at it from the point of view of an information security, cybersecurity geek, one area that is of constant concern is that of what we call INA, so identification and authentication. In short, identification and authentication means answering the questions first, who are you when you approach me? And secondly, how do I know you are who you say you are? And I think it is an obvious that if you're dealing with things at a nation state level, that becomes pretty important. If you are on the receiving end of a weapon coming after you or coming after your territory, it's useful to have a sense, and that's usually the first item on your agenda from a military point of view, is figuring out, first off, who was the source of that offensive act, and secondly, how do you know it was that person? Or it was that nation state. First off, the differentiation between a nation state and an unnation state is pretty critical. But even if you're reasonably certain that it is a nation state that has committed an act against you, there are usually a number of players might find it in their strategic best interest to be able to fake, to make something that comes from them appear to have come from another nation, so that logically, if I am nation A and I have two other nations with whom I have lukewarm at best relationships, and I'm concerned about both of them. To me, an optimal strategic move would be to have one appear to wage war on the other, with the probably reasonable assumption that the two of them will keep each other busy, and in the meantime, effectively have some protective, one might argue, some protective and other advantages for my nation state, simply because I divert two of my worst enemies, and furthermore, maybe in a position where I can do away with both of them without me having to do much of anything. So those sorts of scenarios are an obvious first issue, and I suspect one that takes up a fair amount of bandwidth in the diplomatic world.
Yes.
There are a lot of things wrapped up in that inability to determine for certain, and particularly in cyber attack world, where offensive items, where strikes come from, and to whom you can actually assign attribution. Because you'll have other situations, and that's another complicating factor with cyber attacks in general, cyber war in general, is that you don't necessarily have a binding of the origin of the problem to a standardly recognized physical location. I may have something that comes out of a point on the internet that may be in actually friendly territory, or my own territory for that matter, that is very clearly targeting my defense assets and doing so in a really obnoxious way. It's a problem. I may have issues with being able to trustably trace back from that friendly point. It's difficult to make good decisions, and particularly decisions you're inclined to back up with a weapon strike. Yes. Given imperfect, or for that matter, very, very imperfect information. Yes. So it sort of changes the game, and changes it in a lot of cases in nerve-wracking ways if you're responsible for managing those things.
Yes, you are absolutely right. Do you see any possibility that there are some technological innovations that are underway or in preparation that would help those kind of challenges, especially about the identification and authentication? Because if we have the power, technological power, to identify or authenticate who is behind this, that would make so many things simple and so much easier in validating pretty much whatever is happening in the cyberspace.
Well, I think that the other issue on that is that in other areas of diplomacy in general, it tends to be too often a zero-sum game. For every person who gains who loses because of a perceived deficiency, chances are there are at least a couple of entities who find it in their best interest for that problem to exist. It's in that particular, there's a great deal of work that has been done in identification and authentication. I find it telling that it has taken easily 30 or 40 years for the market for those technologies in the commercial realm, the market for those technologies to actually appear. Most of the things, if you look at from a market point of view, and thanks to my time as a venture capitalist, I look at things through this prism. The market done and the sales figures for folks who function in the identification authentication space are tend to lag behind other areas. We're into shiny toys still in cybersecurity commercial markets. So you'll have fundamental needs like that go begging when they should have been ubiquitous by now.
Right.
Even as you have other things that are a questionable benefit that get you get the extreme valuation that move a lot of units. It's one of the frustrations of wanting to get things done in a particular way and wanting to see people make money in getting those things done, or the right people. I found that was my wake-up call. You want the right people to be making money and selling the right items.
Right. So it's not glamorous enough for some people. I see that. So as
Oh yes,
not glamorous.
very much so.
Right. So as the information and communication technologies continue to increase in strategic importance and risk to nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, and also individuals, the rapid development and deployment of these digital technologies creates both independent and interdependent risk for each component of NGIOAI. That means nations, its government, industries, organizations, academia, and individuals. So while the nature of risk varies by the environment of the initiative, entity, or a nation, both internal and external, what are the challenges you see facing critical infrastructures across industries that is becoming a cause of concern to not only its current state, but also the survivability of nations and the global community?
Oh heavens, I think that one of the issues that's on so many different levels. One of the issues is that you see use of information technology pieces and critical infrastructure components that sort of violate the original expectations of the designer of those components with regard to security. I think, for instance, you see chips that were used to control power plants or factory floor automation or other things. You see similarly operating system software or application software that end up brought into those environments and put in place inside those systems that frankly are not of a quality that they need to be security-wise. So a lot of the task in terms of critical infrastructure protection, a lot of the work that's gone heretofore has been identifying those, or doing a better job of identifying those situations and addressing them. The whole Volkswagen debacle, for instance, this week has been a real interesting worked example of that. It's obvious that there are perhaps some lapses in terms of quality control of the software itself. That is one situation I'm following with great interest, simply because the scenario is so fundamental to a lot of the infrastructure that we rely on ubiquitously worldwide. Down to the lowliest end user, but also up to the biggest military force. The vehicles, the software in question, I would be really surprised if I didn't see it in, for instance, a lot of military situations, a lot of military vehicles. It's hard to contain those sorts of things, but in effect, we're suffering from a situation where it's almost like we're in the automotive industry again, by analogy. But in the automotive industry, it took us a long time to get our act together regarding safety standards for vehicles from a variety of perspectives. But also, it took us a long time to wrap protections that we took for granted, like insurance mechanisms and other risk management mechanisms around it. We still have a ways to go in security. We've been dancing our way around the notion of how in commercial installations and how you basically assign insurance to issues and insurance against cyber-specific risks to these structures. And frankly, I think it's going to be a while before we even remotely approach the actuarial modeling that would be appropriate for these situations. It's one that's been it's been a topic of discussion for at least 20 years, and I'm aware of, and I suspect predates that by quite a bit. When it comes to the rest of critical infrastructure, we have a lot of scary situations.
Yes.
I deal with and have advised quite a few of the folks, industry associations and so forth, who govern the industries that are charged with running a lot of this critical infrastructure. And pretty much to an industry, they're all pretty worried. A lot of them, they're still stuck on the notion of if we only achieve compliance, regulatory compliance in these areas, then our job is done. And I end up being the person around the table saying, but those don't take into consideration this particular hazard or that particular hazard or this particular vulnerability. What are you going to do if someone exercises this vulnerability to this particular effect? And the joke we have is that typically we walk away from these meetings and there are a whole lot of managers who came in, happy because they were in compliance, who walk away a little shakier, a little bit more ashen-faced than when they walked in. But it's a very real issue, and frankly, I think that it becomes a measure of the clue of the person running the installation as to how much they're worried about those exposures.
Yes, you're right, and I think you talked about the real challenge that we face is that the resources and the attention is only on what industries are forced to do, that is compliance and legal risk and operational risk and things like that. Where the biggest impact is the strategic risk, and the industries are not focused on that because that is not something that they are forced to do. They can get away with not thinking about it because of the culture that we have, that everyone sees things short term, and they don't know if they are going to be there in 2 years or 3 years to be evaluated for the performance or decisions that they're taking right now. So that is a real challenge, and for that, that the whole notion is that let's just focus on compliance risk and we are done with it when we take care of our legal responsibilities, and let's not worry about any other critical risk. That is a real challenge, and we need to I hope there is a bigger and better awareness about the critical necessity of addressing strategic risk and addressing the integrated and interdependent challenges that comes with the infrastructure, because it's not just the independent risk that we have to address to manage the critical infrastructure risk, because it is not confined within the any particular entities or industries boundaries to manage those risks, because they are all connected to so many other suppliers and vendors, and they have a lot of interdependent risk, and we don't have a framework right now by which we can manage the interdependent risk. While there is a great effort to manage enterprise risk, there is no proper framework or processes established to manage the interdependent integrated risk. And people are, even I'm sure that in some industries and some businesses are able to identify these interdependent risks, but after identifying what is the next step, how do they manage that, who is responsible, who is accountable, none of those things are defined, and there is no proper structure established. So the integrated risk management framework that is not there is a critical challenge right now for everyone.
Well, I think one thing that ended up being begged. I think we've been the beneficiaries of some unusually good thinking on the part of the U.S. government, in that I think that the folks at NIST, which handles basically national level standards for technology, realized early on that if they did it right, that the standards world could give us at least a template via which we could cure those things we knew about, at least put out there the solutions. and they, in that situation, actually give teeth, and value to the regulatory compliance piece of things. They understood that folks were going to do that simply because the markets require it of them if they're publicly traded. And they thought, well, maybe this in the government world and this in the private world might actually give us an ability to nail down what's considered stable ground, gives us a foundation that we can build on, the individual firms can build on, and for that matter, government organizations can build on. We can basically go through, determine whether the standards make sense, whether they actually remedy real problems, and do so in an optimal fashion. And with a wave of a hand, we can nail those down and have something that then we can pass off to an entire generation and entire industries or regulatory compliance folks, and have some faith that they'll be executed and that you'll see benefit from them. They don't have a lot of funding. They never have enough as far as I'm concerned. They've done an extraordinary job of recruiting folks who are unusually clueful in the area. And those folks who are in place, I think, have done a masterful job. They very rarely get credit for having done so. So that's one piece of it. I'm happy to say that appears to work. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of work to do.
No, I agree.
But
it is a good start.
I think that it's useful to talk about that as a critical piece of the protection infrastructure.
Yes. No, it is a good start, Becky. The NIST framework that was released a few months before, it is a good start, but there are very critical, gaps and challenges in that framework, because it encourages public and private enterprises to work together. But just by saying that, hey, you and you work together, it doesn't happen. There needs to be some sort of incentive, some sort of structure, so that it allows them to have that kind of collaboration and partnership. I mean, we know that human nature is such that some people require just very simple basic fact that, okay, I need to do something better, I need to identify the risks that are within my control and manage it. But some people require some incentives, some financial incentives, some other kind of incentives to be able to identify and take it forward to the right appropriate decision makers, that, hey, this is the risk. So it without having that defined structure, just by saying public private you need to work together, it's not going to happen. And the second challenge and gap that I found in the NIST framework is that it talks only about information security. I didn't see anywhere the role of strategic risk. And to me, cybersecurity, when you are telling that this is a cybersecurity risk management framework, there needs to be some sort of framework for strategic risk and cybersecurity, and there needs to be a proper definition that cybersecurity is not information security. You are saying that this is a cybersecurity framework, then at least define what cybersecurity is, because to me it was purely about information security. And again, it is a great start. It's a great initiative, and they are very open that they're going to, as they get more information, they're going to work on it and make it better, adaptable, and for the benefit of the industries and governments and nations. But I think at this point, even if I feel that even if all the organizations implement that framework, I think that it's not going to be likely effective, and it will not serve its purpose in managing the cybersecurity risks. That is, at this point, I feel that there are very critical gaps and challenges with that framework.
Well, I think too, though, that there's a tendency. First, I'm told I have a dear and old friend. I wrote a legal book with him, who is an attorney, and for that matter, an attorney general, so a prosecutor, specialized in electronic crimes for much of his career. And he becomes sort of my wake-up call and reality check as to when the stuff hits the road from a legal perspective. And one thing he's fond of reminding me of is that when it comes to technology, the only thing that's had anything remotely near the pervasive effect of information technology on the society is probably automotive technology. And he says, it took well over 100 years
Yes.
to even start getting that right. And he says that as it is, that it accounts for an incredible measure, incredible percentage of state and local statutes have nothing, deal with nothing but automotive, the maintenance and operation of an automotive on public roads. So it has taken 100 years. It maintains, it has basically made state and local legal codes at considerable expense. A lot of law enforcement effect goes to dealing with only that aspect of technology. And he says that given the adaptability of IT, it would be naive to expect it to take much less time to get
Yes.
it right. And he says, I think you guys are, because you're so accustomed to the IT giving you a measure, a workable result in microseconds, that you guys are perhaps a wee bit unrealistic in expectation there. You might need to adjust those.
I hear you that it requires time. All these developing such complex frameworks, it does require time, and it does require more resources and effort. So we just have to wait and see how these collaborations shape up. That could make this NIST framework more effective, or we have to see what other frameworks are coming along, because I also know, I mean, we also know that a lot of entities in private industry are also putting together effective framework. But that's another challenge, that it's not that there is a lack of framework. There are frameworks coming from across nations, across governments, across industries, private entities and businesses. There are lots and lots of different kind of framework and different kind of standards, but there are so many of them. So I mean, if you are a private entity, what framework you have to go forward with, what entity, what kind of standards you have to go forward with, because it depends on which country you are, which nation you are in, and what industry you are in. There are so many different framework and different ways of doing things. So how do you know which one is more effective and which one you have to go forward with? So again, that global standards will come into picture, global framework. Which are the global institutions? Who is going to be responsible for developing these frameworks? Who is going to be responsible for developing the standards of the cybersecurity or cyberspace? So those big questions are out there. It is not that there is any shortage of talent or intellectual capability or potential. We have plenty of that across nations. But where is the unifying institution, unifying framework that everyone can feel comfortable with? That okay, we have that framework, let's adopt that, and let's implement that, and let's work on it wholeheartedly, so that we can manage these complex risks that we are facing right now and we will be facing in the coming years. But we don't have those global standards. So right now there are a lot of questions, and there are a lot of entities. I'm sure you are also hearing in across private industries and all different industries and across nations, that they don't know which framework they should be implement and where they should go from here.
Well, I think that there's a tendency to want to approach things as as Madison Avenue would, for instance. From the way the world as it is, the outpicturing of the world as advertising would have you believe it is, versus all of the really gross and grimy aspects of the real world. Part of the divide, I think we put this before, everyone has their own take of where the differentiation is between information security and all of its horrible glory, and cybersecurity, which I'm sure isn't not that much neater. And to me, the issue is that in cybersecurity, we finally understand that you cannot look at information security absent context. You have to be able to understand and have a way of being able to marry the issues of information security and fit it to a specific context. And I think a lot of what you're talking about in terms of framework is that there's a tendency to want to use a framework development. If you're on one of the committees, there's a temptation to say, this is how I can basically encapsulate my attitude and worldview in ways so that everybody can utilize it to protect their system or deal with systems at their point of view. And I think that you've got to be humble enough to say the nature of frameworks basically want you to underreach, if anything, nail down those things that you know are absolute. And also make extremely clear this is where you as an individual practitioner, because you want somebody to work with a practitioner on this one, this is where you pick up and we let off. The framework will give you this much of the skeleton. This is how you begin to assess what you need to add on to it to make it meaningful for your context. And this is what might be the start of a set of components you use to build that out. These are ones that have withstood the test with these constraints. These are the ones that have withstood, the test of application in other similar contexts. We have this ongoing, we've had this ongoing, not quite argument, discussion, a lunch table discussion, which ironically is what sucked me into computer security in the beginning to begin with. It was the best lunch bunch on earth. But a lot of what we talked about is that what does it mean to be, and what will it mean to be a computer security, information security practitioner going forward? And one thing that kept going up for me, I always assumed when I was a child that I would grow up to be a physician and end up disqualified because of some handicaps from going to medical school. And it turns out perhaps I get to be more of a physician now as an information security practitioner than my own doctor gets to be, thanks to managed healthcare.
Yes, yes.
But there are a lot of similarities in terms of the messiness, the theoretical messiness, yet reliance on strong theory of the practice of medicine and the practice of information security. You're dealing with, you can have more interesting conversations. If you're interested in doing the metrics, one can argue that it isn't even general medicine. It's a matter of, it's more a matter of like public health. If you practice public health and epidemiology and perhaps a specialty, in obscure epidemics or something like that. I assert that if you deal with stakeholders, be they system owners, be they people who depend on those systems, and this includes nations and states, and decision makers, and leaders of governments in that realm, you're in a position where you still serve a lot of what one would expect of their own physician. You want somebody who can basically come in, hold your hand and say, okay, the world has not just ended because of this or that particular attack or threat. That sit down and talk about what needs to be done and which of it we're equipped to do right now and which of it need to be on your to-do list going forward, which of these need to be a priority. And talk about the different measures that we can take to deal with what we've got before us.
Sure. Sure. No, I hear you. I mean, there are, yes, we have a good starting point. We have to build on that. And we have to also keep in mind the changing nature of the enterprises that we have, that, any business entity or any enterprise is not just located within our nation's geographical boundaries. They are all across nations. So there are fundamental changes in how we define enterprise, how we define security, and how we define integrated risk management, approach, and how we have to do things. So there are a lot of question marks because there are rapid changes happening in the way we do things, in the way things are shaping up across nations. So it is going to take time to define and identify and define all those different parameters that needs to be in place to make it effective, and we all have to collaborate and work together to make it happen. And because security is no longer a government affair, it's an NGIOA affair. That's what I say, that there was a time where government was able to provide security to everyone. Now is not possible because of the changing global fundamentals, and everyone has to get involved. That means nations, it's government, industries, organizations, and academia. We all have a role to play in getting security and achieving security. So having said that, let's move forward. As the use of social media technologies is expanding into new areas and new ways of doing things, for example, surge in communities, collaboration, and commerce, the regulatory requirements are trying to catch up across industries. What regulatory challenges do you see social media technologies bringing for not only security to the industries but also for nations?
I think there that effectively storms are a fact of life. That you're going to end up with situations where things that are totally off the wall end up being pervasive through your entire populace. I think that there is a tendency, if you haven't spent a career in political science or in government itself, there's a tendency for you to overestimate and overassume the number of citizens that actually will take an active role and be vocal to you. I think that social media gives you the opportunity to be visible to a portion of your populace that you probably were not visible to before. This is presuming a democratic state. And non-democratic state, it gives you an extremely powerful way of dealing with putting forth your own propaganda. I mean, it basically puts propaganda in the hands of the most humble of citizens, yeah. And that's good news and bad news, depending on what you think's in the best interest of your nation state.
Yes.
So it's a very powerful. It again becomes a powerful capability, and it becomes one that's relatively unfettered in terms of access.
Yes.
And I think that it just requires a different set of operating rules and methods to deal with it. And I don't see that folks who are frankly bright and experienced enough to know better, I don't see evidence that they really understand how to maneuver in this realm. Witness the politician from New York who determined that it was in his best interest to put interesting pictures of himself out.
Yeah.
That was a wee bit extreme and ill thought. But I think that folks, that the novelty of the experience of being on social media still hasn't worn off. And that it will end up basically being yet another outpicturing of your persona that you got to manage. I think folks are reasonably okay with that if they're at some level of government. They understand that. But I still see evidence that there are other folks out there who are in that realm who don't get it, who just don't understand that it requires management, let alone have a sense of how to manage their own image.
Yes, you're right. So coming to another point about mobile devices. Now coming from social media to mobile devices, rapid expansion of the number of mobile devices, m-commerce, and the application functionality and processes introduces new opportunities as well as risk. What kind of security controls needs to be in place for lost and stolen devices to prevent security risk? Because now we know that people use their personal devices, phones, iPads, and those kind of, all kinds of gadgets at work, and they have their work information on that. So what kind of security controls and private entities or governments needs to put in place so that the security controls so that they can effectively manage their security risk?
Well, as I indicated before, I think that the orphan child of security up until now has been a strong authentication, strong identification and authentication. And the thing about that makes the neglect of it so pressing to me is that it needs to occur, it needs to be a nested model. It needs to not only identify you to any of your devices, you personally, but also needs to identify your devices. And some would argue that it needs to identify the software on those devices to the device and subsequently to you. That needs to be bound together so that when an application speaks for you, it in fact speaks for you with your permission and your authority. And part of what can be that can be the device itself. There's another reasonably active design mechanism in security, a way of conceptualizing where you put trust, that advocates not trusting the device itself, considering the device simply a receptacle, and not putting trust in that device inherently, so that if you lose the device, it becomes, it's of no value. It doesn't give access in and of itself to something that matters to you elsewhere in the web. Cloud-based technologies tend to serve tend to have protections built into them that serve these goals well, and minimize the effect of having lost or have stolen, an access device. But the other rule, if I've learned anything over the years I've been in security, is that there's always a weak link in these suckers. And the chances anymore of that weak link staying private are really remote. So to an extent, too, it becomes a matter of we have a duty in terms of talking to users and saying, it's really, really critical for you to protect this in the same way that you would your wallet. There's no differentiation, as you wouldn't walk around, and stroll around and be very casual on how you manage your wallet. You probably don't want to manage your cell phone sloppily either. These protections are appropriate. Yes. And that becomes part of just the fabric or social fabric.
Yes. Yes, I mean, we hear some...
regardless of the role they play.
Right. No, I mean, we hear a lot of, major corporations, they have come out with guidelines that, you should not even leave your laptop out of your sight for a minute also. You just keep it with you all the time. So yes, those kind of effective guidelines would, probably bring the culture change, and that we need to manage this security challenges that we have. Now, there is another interesting development that I have been seeing, is that there are many who says that reduced enterprise RT resources, support and budgets has led to multiple shadow IT organizations within enterprises, and that shadow groups tend to not follow established security control procedures and are becoming a cause of concern. What are your thoughts on shadow organizations and the complex security risk it brings to entities across industries by failure to comply with corporate IT policies and controls?
You are out of my milieu on that. So I have no commentary on that.
Okay. So probably this is the last question: is that digital technology innovation today outpace security that impacts not only cyberspace but also geospace, and in the coming years probably space. Rapid demand for the latest and greatest software package by not only consumers but also businesses often drives developers to take shortcuts, use outdated code, or not fully test new products in order to get the product to the market or end user quickly and rapidly. This can result in softwares that are not sufficiently vetted against security vulnerabilities or system compatibility. What are your thoughts on this innovation race in the cyberspace that compromises security in CGS? That means cyberspace, geospace.
This becomes tantamount to requiring safety testing of automobiles. In my opinion, we're in a position where we have a lot of really bad code out there, And part of this, I mean, the origins of it are necessarily malicious in intent. Part of this simply is an issue, is a function of the speed with which IT took hold, and the fact that academia was extremely slow to catch up with it. So you have a lot of folks who have written really critical code who have no formal education in software. Even when they have formal educations in software, those educations are extremely uneven quality. You don't see a lot of consistency across exposures for folks who ostensibly have formal educations in IT. The folks, I was fortunate in that I was mentored by some of the pioneers of computer security in the old, from the old days, the folks who did the Orange Book and Rainbow series for US DoD, for instance, one of the first projects, and whose involvement dated from the Ware Commission that a lot of folks consider to be the official start of computer security. And they said this was a no-brainer. They said we were looking at this for about 6 months and said, oh, screw this. We've got to understand how to build good code. We need to understand how to really nail down systems. Ironically, they did a good start. A group pulled together in the 70s, 60s, and 70s it did an operating system called Multics, which was broadly accepted and had some fabulous features that I have yet, I don't see replicated much these days, but they were, one of the things that made them unique is that they really nailed down a lot of security stuff. So we know how to build pieces of this security. That's one thing I've been working on at South Alabama. One of the things I came here to help do was to build out an undergraduate through graduate through PhD program. And our program is not cybersecurity, it's in cyber assurance, where cyber assurance is basically defined as the study of how to build more secure systems. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself, I'll tell you, I sat in on all of the curriculum committees and so forth that we submitted. And it was a really tight fit to get in all of the courses we thought needed covering in order to make the degree program up. And the degree technically is by definition a double major. It could become a triple major with the addition of one additional course. Because of it is a rigorous program. However, I think that the skill set of being able to understand how you nail down code to begin with, how you design systems from the outset so that they are by design and by structure more secure than the standard offering is something that will be of enduring value going forward. I just don't think that corporate America is quite caught up to that. Although, again, I think that the Volkswagen scenario, as well as others, end up as ongoing reminders that software building is a process that needs to be as tightly managed as other areas of fabrication, other areas involved in manufacturing the product for market. So that ends up being, I think, a bit of a wake-up call. And I think any penalties that Volkswagen suffers, be they governmental or be they marketplace, I think they're going to be a significant market pushback to them, may end up motivating folks to try to do it better next go round.
Yes.
It's important. It's important for us to do it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think before we conclude our today's discussion, I would like to ask you this personal question: What attracted you towards this field of cybersecurity? And you have had such an impressive experience so far. You have worked with NSA. You have been a venture capitalist, and you are advising industries on how to on the cyber security and how, especially the strategic nature of the security challenges that they are facing right now. So how did your journey started on this, and where do you see it going forward?
Oh heavens! As I indicated before, when I went to work at NSA, I actually did not originally work in the Computer Security Center, which was a big, which was a big deal. It's the siting for the National Computer Security Center, which at the time was working on the Rainbow series, doing first set of standards for secure systems. I had a group of friends who worked for the center, and we lunched together. And they were the best of buddies, and they always had a lot of interesting things to do. I was building systems elsewhere. And the joke we had was that ultimately they'd end up grabbing me. So they went through several evolutions as the center. I went on and built systems and so forth. And I was in a situation where I needed not to be doing as much travel as I'd been doing. And a friend had an opening and says, well, if you'll come in and straighten out this unholy mess for me, you got a job. So I ended up transitioning into the center in the late 80s. And it was fun in that I already knew a lot of the folks there. The things I was assigned to do, I had differences of opinions with my management, and gave me the opportunity to take certain things to market, which I really liked doing. And I ended up in the most special of communities. And as I determined that I needed to not be, at NSA anymore, I got a lot of links into what came next. I took a stint as a operational security officer at Los Alamos. And then from there ended up with calls from other folks in the community who said, well, we have this that we think you ought to do next, even as you figure out what you're really going to do next. And that took me to the Valley and subsequently back here. So it's been a matter of, I still work with a lot of the same people I worked with 30 years ago, where none of us belong to the same organizations. But also, we're all still very much carrying on, the ongoing conversation as to what comes next, it does is. Most of us have had an effect on how this area has gone, which has been fun. But the joke is that none of us, a common attribute of us across the board is that none of us deal well with boredom and security. That's never been an issue.
Yes.
Always something else coming on.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I am really honored that you agreed to come on Risk Roundup, and we thank you for that. We appreciate all your thoughts and all the information that you provided for the benefit of the global community, and especially for the security industry, because your thoughts are very important and in the right direction, and it's going to benefit and help the global security industry tremendously. And we hope that in future you come again and share some more thoughts about what you feel where the IT industry is going and what kind of changes we'll be seeing in the coming years. So that's it for today, friends. Although we can talk about this topic for for a long time, probably we can talk for hours on this without stopping. I think we need to stop at this point, because after 1 hour probably everybody would say, okay, we probably need to have several different breaks to listen to such a wonderful discussion that it can become a one-day seminar. Let me just put it that way. So this is such a very informative topic, but we have come to the end of our allotted time. So for more information on Risk Roundup and the upcoming sessions, please go to riskgroupllc.com. Thank you, everyone, and please join us again. Thank you so much, Becky. It was really nice talking to you, and we wish you and the center the very best, and we look forward to seeing more initiatives that come out, like you were just mentioning about cyber security insurance and other areas that the center is working on. And we look forward to having that for the benefit of not only the academic community and universities and students, but also for the industries and to manage their security risk and to understand actually what those security challenges are. So thank you so much, and good luck for that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.